The men in suits didn't knock. That was the first thing Rowan Ashford noticed when the door to his barn swung open without warning, three strangers in pressed wool coats stepping over his threshold like they already owned the ground beneath their boots. The one in front carried a leather satchel and wore the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. "Mr. Ashford," the man didn't offer his hand. "You've been served." He dropped the papers onto the hay-covered floor. Not handed them. Dropped them. Like Rowan was a tenant. Like 31 years of his family's blood in this soil meant exactly nothing. Rowan looked down at the documents, then back up at the man. "This ranch," the man said, smoothing his lapel, "belongs to Western Frontier Rail as of 60 days from today. I'd suggest you make arrangements." He turned and walked out before Rowan could find a single word. If someone came to your door one morning and told you that everything you had ever worked for, everything you had ever buried your grief inside, was about to be taken by men who had never once touched the dirt they were claiming, what would you do? If you've ever been told that the law is whatever the powerful say it is, you already know exactly how Rowan felt standing in that barn, alone, holding papers that were about to change everything. So, before we go any further, if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications, because every week we bring you stories like this one. Stories about ordinary people pushed past what they could bear, and what happened when they refused to break. Drop your city and country in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. And if you stay until the very end, I promise you this one does not end the way you expect. Now, let's go back to where it all truly started. The letter had taken 11 days to reach him. Rowan Ashford knew this because he had counted. Not obsessively, just the quiet, practical way a man counts things when he has too much silence and not enough reason to fill it. 11 days from the post rider's last visit, and when the envelope finally appeared on the station master's counter in Caldwell's Creek, Rowan almost didn't pick it up. He stood there in his coat, mud on his boots, and stared at his own name written in a woman's handwriting for a long moment before sliding it into his pocket without opening it. He read it that night by the fire, alone, the way he did everything. Her name was Evelyn Hartwell. She was 34 years old. She had been a school teacher in Missouri for 7 years before the school closed. She had been married once before. She mentioned it briefly, without detail. The way a person mentions a scar they've decided to stop explaining. She said she was practical. She said she was not afraid of hard work. She said she understood the arrangement being proposed and she did not require romance, only honesty. Rowan read that last line 3 times. He wrote back the following morning. His own letter was short, 4 sentences. He told her the winters were severe. He told her the nearest town was 2 hours by wagon. He told her he had a dog named Cole and a barn that needed a new roof come spring. He did not tell her about his first wife. He did not tell her about the medicine or the storm or the 3 days he spent on the mountain pass when the world went white and silent and he arrived home to a cabin that had gone quiet in a way no fire could fix. He sent the letter and told himself it was simply a practical arrangement. He told himself that for 6 weeks. The station platform at Fort Mercer was exactly 6 boards wide and smelled of pine resin and coal smoke. Rowan arrived 40 minutes early, which he would not have admitted to anyone. He stood near the far end of the platform with his hands in his coat pockets and watched the locomotive crawl out of the dark tree line like something prehistoric and exhausted. He had formed no particular image of what she would look like. He had deliberately avoided doing so, but some part of his mind had apparently decided anyway. Something meek, perhaps. Someone who would step down from that train with wide, uncertain eyes and need reassuring. Evelyn Hartwell stepped down from the 3rd car, carrying a single worn suitcase, and she did not look uncertain about a single thing. She was not beautiful in the way paintings were beautiful. She was something else. There was a steadiness in the way she moved, a quality of attention. She scanned the platform the way a person scans a room they intend to understand before they speak in it. Her coat was clean, but visibly old. Her hair was pinned with the efficiency of someone who had stopped caring about perfection and started caring about function. When her eyes found him, and they found him immediately, without hesitation, she walked toward him without waiting to be approached. "Mr. Ashford," she said. "Miss Hartwell." A pause. Neither of them extended a hand. It wasn't coldness exactly. It was more like two people recognizing that they were standing at the edge of something large, and neither wanted to perform a greeting neither of them believed in. "The wagon's this way," he said. "All right," she said. That was the entirety of their first conversation. The drive home took 2 hours and 20 minutes. Rowan knew this because he had made it hundreds of times. He did not attempt to fill the silence. He expected her to, expected questions about the property, the livestock, the house, the kind of nervous talk people use to paper over discomfort. Evelyn sat on the wagon bench beside him and watched the mountains without speaking, and the longer the silence lasted, the more it stopped feeling like awkwardness and started feeling like something neither of them had a word for. At one point, the left rear wheel caught a rut, and the wagon lurched badly enough that she grabbed the bench with her right hand. Her left hand did not move to him for steadiness. She righted herself and said nothing. He noticed that. The cabin came into view just as the last light was failing. 2 rooms, stone chimney, a covered porch that needed new boards on the west side. From a distance, it looked like what it was. A functional shelter that had stopped pretending to be a home sometime in the past 3 years. "It's smaller than I imagined," she said. It was the first thing she had said in over an hour. "Most things are." She looked at him then, and he thought for a moment he saw something like humor cross her face. Just a flicker, there and gone. "I'll need to know where you keep things," she said. "In the morning, when it's light. I'll show you." "You don't need to show me, just tell me where they are." He pulled the wagon to a stop and set the brake and sat there for a moment before he answered. "Pantry's on the north wall, firewood stacked east side of the barn. Tools are hung left of the barn door." "Thank you," she said, and climbed down before he could offer a hand. She found the wound herself. He hadn't mentioned it, hadn't planned to. His left shoulder had been carrying a deep bruise and what he suspected was a partially torn muscle since the incident with the fence post 3 weeks prior, and he had managed it the way he managed most things, by not mentioning it and using his right side for anything that required actual force. The third morning after her arrival, she came into the barn where he was attempting to lift a feed sack, and she watched him for approximately 4 seconds before she said, "Put that down." He didn't. "I'm fine." "You're compensating with your right side and have been since I arrived. Put the bag down, Mr. Ashford." The directness of it startled him enough that he set the bag down. Not because he was told to, he told himself that immediately, but because the certainty in her voice was the kind that didn't leave you much to argue against. She examined the shoulder with clean hands and a practical efficiency that had nothing romantic in it whatsoever. She pressed in 2 specific places and watched his face. "Torn," she said. "Strained." "Torn, partially. You've been pulling against it. That's why it hasn't healed." He said nothing. "I'll bind it tonight. You'll need to stop using it as the dominant side for 2 weeks, or it will tear completely, and then we'll have a real problem." "It's fine," he said again. The words were reflex by now. Not defiance, just the deeply ingrained habit of a man who had no one to report his damage to. Evelyn looked at him for a moment, not with pity, something more clear-eyed than that. "I'm not asking because I'm concerned about you personally," she said. "I'm asking because if your shoulder tears completely, I cannot run this homestead alone. So, tonight, I'll bind it." He understood immediately that this was a gift dressed as practicality. The only kind of gift he might accept without throwing up a wall. He understood it, and he chose not to examine it. "Fine," he said. The first snowstorm arrived 8 days after she did, and it arrived the way the worst ones always did in the Blackstone Range. Not gradually, but all at once, as if the mountain had been holding its breath and finally stopped. By the second morning, the drifts were chest-high against the north wall of the cabin. The trail to town was gone. The only world that existed was the one inside and immediately around 4 walls of stone and timber, and Rowan Ashford had not shared that world with another living person, not counting Cole, who slept by the fire and had the good sense to want nothing from anyone, in 3 years and 2 months. He did not sleep well that first night of the storm. He lay in the dark on his side of what had been, in another life, a shared bed, and listened to the wind throw itself against the roof, and thought about how strange it was that the presence of another person in the next room made the silence louder somehow. More defined. Like the difference between an empty room and a room with something in it you are deliberately not looking at. At some point after midnight, he heard her moving. Not much, just the creak of a board, the soft sound of someone sitting up. Then nothing. He didn't call out. Neither did she. In the morning, she was already at the stove when he came out of the bedroom, and she handed him coffee without asking if he wanted any, and he took it without saying thank you, and somehow that was its own kind of conversation. The question she asked him came on the 14th night. They had fallen into a rhythm by then, an unspoken one, the kind that develops not by design but by repetition. He maintained the livestock and handled the structural work. She managed the interior and the food, and had taken over the record-keeping without asking, which he had noticed and said nothing about because her numbers were cleaner than his. In the evenings, they sat near the fire, not talking, each doing something with their hands. He repaired harnesses. She mended clothes and occasionally read from a small book she kept on the windowsill, the cover of which he had not yet managed to see clearly. The fire had burned low. The storm outside was older and quieter now, more permanent than dramatic. And she looked up from her book and said, without preamble, "What was her name?" He didn't pretend not to understand. "Clara." "How long ago?" 3 years, this February." A silence. Not an uncomfortable one. More like space being made for something that deserved space. "You don't have to explain anything," Evelyn said. "I'm not asking you to." "Then why ask?" She considered this genuinely. "Because you carry it in the way you move. And I've been trying to figure out whether it's grief or guilt. And I've decided it's both. And I thought it might be better for you to know that someone else had noticed." Rowan put the harness down, stared at the fire for a long moment. "The passes closed early," he said finally. "She got sick in November. I went for medicine. The storm came in fast, faster than anyone predicted. 3 days I was stuck on the east side of the mountain." He stopped. "You don't have to kit." "She was already gone when I got back." He said it flat, not dramatically. Just the way a fact falls out of a person after they've been carrying it too long and something in the air shifts slightly and it just drops. "She lasted 2 days without the medicine. If I'd left even 6 hours earlier, You don't know that. I know the timing. Timing isn't the same as cause." She said it quietly, but with the kind of certainty that wasn't cruelty. It was precision. The difference between someone who is trying to make you feel better and someone who is trying to make you see clearly. You made the decision a person makes when they believe they have time. The storm made a different decision. Those are not the same thing. Rowan looked at her then. Really looked, which he had been careful not to do too directly since she'd arrived. "You speak like someone who's had to argue herself out of something similar," he said. The line landed between them. He saw her absorb it. A slight stillness, the almost imperceptible adjustment people make when something finds the mark. "My husband," she said. "My first one. He didn't die. He just stopped seeing me. Over years. Until one morning I realized I had been invisible inside my own marriage for so long that I had almost forgotten what it felt like to take up space in a room." She paused. "That's not grief the way yours is grief. But it does a similar kind of damage to the parts of yourself you use to trust people." Rowan said nothing for a long moment. Then, "I'm sorry." "Don't be sorry," she said. "Just don't do that to me." He held her gaze. Something moved through the room that neither of them named. Not romance, not yet, and maybe not in any conventional way, but something more foundational than that. The kind of recognition that happens between two people who have both, separately, learned what it costs to be failed by someone who was supposed to be present. "I won't," he said. He meant it. He was not entirely sure he was capable of it, but he meant it in the moment, and the moment was real, and that had to count for something. Bob. Cole barked twice just after dawn on the 22nd day. Rowan was already half awake when the sound registered. The dog only barked twice in a row when something or someone was outside the perimeter of the barn. Not a threat necessarily, but something that didn't belong in the usual order of things. He pulled on his coat and boots and stepped outside into air that tasted like iron. 3 riders were picking their way down the trail through the thinning snow. They wore good coats. Their horses were too well kept for this part of the mountains. One of them carried a satchel strapped across his chest. Rowan stood on the porch and waited. He didn't call out. He let them come to him. The lid rider reined up at the gate and looked at Rowan with the practiced pleasantness of a man who used pleasantness the way other men used hammers. "Mr. Ashford, good morning. My name is Gerald Fitch. I represent Western Frontier Rail." He reached into his coat and produced an envelope. "We've been trying to reach you. The winter complicated things." His smile did not waver. "I wonder if we might speak inside." "We can speak here," Rowan said. Fitch's smile adjusted slightly. "Of course, as you prefer." He extended the envelope. "The company has acquired the rights to this land through a title claim originally filed with the Territorial Office in what claim? In 1861, by the previous registered landholder. The documentation is all, I've held this land since 1867. My deed is registered." "Yes." Fitch's voice was patient in the way that was designed to make the other person feel slow. "However, the prior claim supersedes your registration under Territorial Code section." "Get off my property," Rowan said. A pause. Fitch's smile finally, barely, fractured. "Mr. Ashford, the company is prepared to offer you fair compensation." "I said get off my property." The three men exchanged a glance. Then Fitch reached into the satchel and produced a second, thicker envelope and dropped it onto the snow beside the gatepost. 60 days, he said. "That's your timeline. I'd strongly advise you to consult a lawyer, though I'll tell you now, no one in Caldwell's Creek is going to take this case." Another smile, the kind that doesn't move the eyes. "Have a good morning, Mr. Ashford." They turned their horses and rode back the way they came. Rowan stood on that porch for a long time after the sound of hoofbeats faded. He did not move. He did not reach for the envelope. The cold worked its way up through his boot soles and into his feet, and he barely felt it. He had come back to this cabin from that mountain 3 years ago with nothing left of himself worth keeping. He had rebuilt it. The cabin, the livestock, the routine, the small daily architecture of a life. Not because he believed it mattered, but because the body keeps going even when the rest of you has stopped asking why. This land was the only reason that motion had eventually become something resembling a reason. He heard the door open behind him. Evelyn stepped onto the porch without her coat, looked at the envelope in the snow, then at his face. "What was that?" she asked. He told her. She said nothing for a moment. Then she stepped off the porch, picked up the envelope, and opened it with the precise, unhurried movements of someone who had decided to look at a thing squarely rather than wait for it to get worse. She read for a long time. Her face did not change, or it changed in ways so interior that only someone watching very carefully would have caught the slight tension around the jaw, the almost invisible narrowing of the eyes that meant her mind was moving quickly and finding things. "Come inside," she said finally. "Evelyn, come inside, Rowan." The first time she had used his name without the formal prefix, she didn't appear to notice. "I need better light, and I need to read this again." He followed her inside. Cole padded in behind them both and lay down by the fire as if the world had not just shifted in a direction that might cost them everything. Evelyn sat at the table with the documents spread before her and read them with a stillness so complete it was almost unsettling. The stillness of a person who has trained themselves to think without leaking. Rowan stood by the window and watched the trail where the three riders had disappeared and felt the weight of 60 days settle onto him like a second winter. Then she said, very quietly, "There's something wrong with the seal on page 3. He turned. Her finger was resting on a specific spot on one of the documents. Her face had gone to something careful and deliberate, the way a person's face goes when they know they've found a thread but aren't ready to pull it yet. "What kind of wrong?" he said. She looked up. "The kind," she said slowly, "that could change everything." Outside, the wind picked up. Coal shifted by the fire. The mountains held their silence the way they always did. Indifferent, enormous, keeping every secret the people at their feet were not yet ready to speak aloud. Rowan Ashford looked at his wife, this practical, direct, not quite known woman who had arrived 11 days after a letter and 2 hours by wagon, and who had, somewhere in the past 3 weeks, quietly become the most steady thing inside these 4 walls. And for the first time in 3 years, something very small and cautious inside his chest moved in a direction that was not backward. She did not pull the thread that night. Rowan had expected her to expected her to unravel whatever she had found in those documents right there at the table, the way a person tears open a wound to clean it rather than let infection settle. Instead, Evelyn stacked the papers back into their original order with careful hands, folded the envelope closed, and set it at the far right corner of the table where it would not be in the way of breakfast. "We'll look at it properly tomorrow," she said, "in daylight, with fresh eyes. You said there was something wrong with the seal." "There is." She stood and moved to the stove without looking at him. "But I want to be sure before I say anything more. I've been wrong before when I was in a hurry." The admission caught him off guard, not because it was startling, but because most people didn't say it. They dressed their uncertainty up as caution, made it sound like wisdom. She said it plainly, the way she said most things, as if accuracy mattered more than the impression it made. "All right," he said. He did not sleep well. That was nothing new. He hadn't slept well since the winter Clara died. And before that, there had been the ordinary sleeplessness of a working man with too much land and not enough help. But that night, the sleeplessness had a different texture. It wasn't grief-shaped. It was closer to the feeling a man gets before a difficult calving, when he knows something is coming and cannot make it come faster. He lay in the dark and listened to the wind work against the north wall and thought about Gerald Fitch's smile. The kind of smile that had already decided the outcome of a conversation before it started. The kind that belonged to men who had never needed to build anything because they had always had the money and the legal language to simply take. 31 years of his family's blood in this ground. His father had broken this soil, had dug the first post holes for the fence line the year after the war ended, his hands still marked by what that war had done to them, unwilling to speak about any of it, just working, forward, always forward, as if motion itself was the only argument worth making against everything that had tried to stop him. Rowan had learned that from him. The motion, the silence, the belief that a man proved what he was through what he built and maintained and refused to abandon. He had not considered until tonight that someone might simply arrive with paperwork and take it all regardless. He got up before sunrise and went to the barn without waking her. She was at the table with the documents when he came back in from the morning feeding. She had made coffee but not yet touched hers. She was sitting with one page held up toward the window, tilted at an angle, squinting at something in the upper left corner with the focused attention of a woman trying to read something not meant to be read. He poured his coffee and sat across from her and said nothing. "Come look at this," she said after a moment. He came around the table and looked at where her finger rested, the territorial seal in the upper corner of the primary claim document. It looked, to his eyes, exactly like every other government seal he had ever seen. Round, embossed, official, in the way only manufactured authority could be. "I don't see it," he said. "The eagle." She tilted the page slightly. "Look at the direction it faces." He looked. The eagle in the seal faced right. "The territorial seals after 1859 all face left," she said. "The design changed when the office was transferred from the provisional authority to the registered territorial government. I know this because I spent 2 years helping a circuit judge in Missouri organize land claim records." She set the page down. "Every legitimate document issued by the Territorial Land Office after August of 1859 carries a left-facing eagle. This document is dated 1861. The eagle faces right." The room was very quiet. "That could be a printing error," Rowan said. He said it not because he believed it, but because he needed to hear her answer. "It could be," she said evenly, "which is why I spent the last hour looking at the rest of it." She spread 3 pages across the table. The signature on page 5, it's signed by a deputy registrar named H.W. Calloway. But according to the date on this document, Calloway didn't take that position until 14 months after this claim was supposedly filed. I know because his appointment was recorded in the Missouri Territorial Circular. I read those as part of my work for the circuit judge. His name appeared in the March 1863 issue. This document is dated January 1862. Rowan straightened up slowly. "Someone signed a dead man's name," he said. "Not dead, just not yet appointed." She paused. "Which in some ways is worse. It means someone knew exactly what they were doing. They didn't grab a random name. They chose a name that would become legitimate later, probably banking on the assumption that nobody would check the exact timeline." But you checked. I noticed, she corrected quietly. There's a difference. Checking implies I was looking for it. I wasn't. I was just reading carefully, the way you read when something feels wrong before you know what the wrong thing is. Rowan pulled out the chair beside her and sat down heavily. Cole, who had been sleeping near the stove, raised his head, read the temperature of the room, and put it back down. They forged it, he said. At least 2 elements of it. Possibly more. I'd need to find copies of legitimate territorial documents to compare against paper quality, ink composition, formatting standards. She folded her hands on the table. But yes, I believe this claim is fraudulent. Believing it and proving it in a court of law are different things. I know that. Any lawyer I could find in Caldwell's Creek, Fitch already told me, I know that too. She was looking at him steadily, not with the expression of someone who had a solution, but with the expression of someone who was refusing to treat the problem as larger than it was. We have 60 days. That's enough time to build a case if we're careful and if we can find the right documentation. We, he said. She didn't flinch from the word. Yes. He studied her face for a moment. This woman who had arrived 3 weeks ago with a worn suitcase and 4 sentences of honest self-description and had proceeded to quietly reorganize his pantry, rebind his shoulder, and now sit across from him cataloging the specific legal frauds being committed against his livelihood. There was something he wanted to say and couldn't locate. Some acknowledgement that sat too large for any of the words he actually had available. Why? He said instead. Just that. She understood what he was asking. He could tell from the slight pause before she answered. Because it's wrong, she said, and because this is my home now too, even if it doesn't feel entirely like that yet. Another pause, shorter. And because I'm better at this than you are. It would be foolish not to use what I know. He almost laughed. It surprised him. Not the almost laugh itself, but the fact that it was genuine, something reflexive rather than performed. He couldn't remember the last time something had moved toward a laugh in him, without effort. All right, he said. Tell me what you need. What she needed first was the original deed. Rowan had kept it in a tin box under the floorboard beside the east wall of the bedroom, a habit his father had started and he had simply continued, the kind of inherited caution that lives in your hands before it lives in your mind. He pulled it out and set it on the table, and Evelyn laid it beside the railroad company's documents and began comparing them with the methodical patience of someone performing surgery on paper. She made a list. Not a dramatic list, just a column of dates, names, and seal descriptions in her tight, economical handwriting. She asked him questions as she worked. When had he first registered the deed? Who had witnessed the filing? Had the territorial office ever sent follow-up correspondence? Had anyone other than himself and his father ever worked the land under any kind of formal arrangement? He answered everything as precisely as he could. When he couldn't answer precisely, he said so, which seemed to matter to her more than a confident wrong answer would have. By mid-afternoon, they had a document of their own, 4 pages of discrepancies, each one noted with date, source, and what legitimate records would need to be found to confirm it. It was not a legal brief. Neither of them was a lawyer. But it had the shape of an argument, and arguments, Rowan had learned from watching his father negotiate with difficult men, were less about volume than about architecture. Where would the legitimate land records be held, he asked. The Territorial Archive Office. It was moved to Harlan's Crossing in 1869 when the county lines were redrawn. She looked up. I can write to the records clerk and request copies of original filings for this land parcel. It'll take time. 2, maybe 3 weeks for a response if the roads are passable. And if they're not? Then someone will need to go in person. She said it as a statement of fact, not as a suggestion. The pass east of the ridge won't be clear for another month at least. Then we write today and hope the letter gets through. She was already reaching for paper. And while we wait, I want to find out everything there is to know about Western Frontier Rail. Who owns it? How many land claims they've made in this territory? Whether any of those claims were contested and what happened. How do you plan to find that out from here? I plan to write to every county clerk's office within 3 days' ride of Blackstone Valley. She dipped the pen. Someone will have records. Companies like this don't commit fraud quietly. They commit it at scale, which means they've done this before. And if they've done it before, there's a trail. Rowan watched her write. Her handwriting was not elegant. It was fast and pressured, the handwriting of someone with too many thoughts and a practical relationship with ink. There was something almost painful about watching her work with that kind of concentrated purpose on behalf of something that had, 3 weeks ago, had nothing to do with her. Evelyn. She didn't stop writing. What was the work you did for the circuit judge? A brief pause. Just brief enough to be intentional. I helped him organize case files, she said. Land disputes, mainly, some probate. I had a good memory for details, and he needed someone who could read a document carefully and flag inconsistencies. She continued writing. I did it for 4 years. Before your marriage. During my marriage. Still writing. My husband considered it embarrassing. A wife working in a courthouse. He tolerated it because the money helped when the harvest was poor, but he never... She stopped, started again. He never asked me a single question about the work. In 4 years. The sentence landed in the room the way certain sentences do. Not dramatically, but with a quiet, specific weight, the weight of a thing said plainly that has been held for a very long time. Rowan did not fill the silence after it. He let it sit, which was the only respectful thing to do. After a moment, she finished the sentence she'd been writing and moved to the next. What? The second storm came on the 31st day of her arrival, and it came angry. Not the heavy, smothering kind, but the sharp, vindictive kind. The kind with wind that found every gap in the wall chinking, and a cold that got into your bones before you understood it was inside rather than out. Rowan spent most of the first day of it reinforcing the barn against the gusts, packing fresh mud and straw into the gaps around the lower boards, checking on the horses every 2 hours because one of them, a 10-year-old gray mare named Patience, badly named, as it turned out, had developed a wet cough that worried him. He came in after dark with ice in his beard and his hands so cold he couldn't fully close them, and Evelyn put a bowl of something hot in front of him without comment and went back to the letters she was drafting at the table. They had received one response already, from a records clerk in Dunmore County, 40 miles east. The clerk had written back in 3 days, which surprised both of them, and his letter confirmed that Western Frontier Rail had filed similar land claims against 4 properties in Dunmore County in the past 18 months. 2 of the landowners had already vacated. One was contesting in court and had, according to the clerk's careful wording, encountered significant difficulties in obtaining legal representation. The 4th had died, a fact reported without apparent suspicion, but which sat uneasily in Rowan's chest when he read it. That's not a coincidence, he said. No, Evelyn agreed. The man who died, we don't know the circumstances. We know the timing. She set her pen down and looked at the letter again. Yes, we know the timing. She folded her hands. Which means we need to be careful. Not frightened, so careful. There's a difference. I know the difference. I know you do. I'm reminding myself as much as you. He looked at her. She was staring at the letter with an expression he was beginning to recognize, the one where her mind was moving faster than her face could keep up with, where she was 3 steps ahead of whatever she appeared to be looking at. You're not afraid of these people, he said. I'm sensibly afraid of these people, she corrected. I just refuse to let sensible fear become the largest thing in the room. He ate his supper. The wind made its argument against the walls. Patience coughed twice from the direction of the barn, and Rowan tracked the sound with the part of his attention that never fully left the livestock, the way a parent tracks the breathing of a sleeping child from the next room. I need to tell you something, he said. Evelyn looked up. After Clara died, I wasn't functional for about 8 months. I kept the animals alive because they needed it, and I didn't have the energy to make a different decision. I didn't plant that spring, lost the east pasture to weeds because I couldn't organize myself to do anything about it. He said it without particular emotion, not because he didn't feel it, but because the shape of the feeling was old enough now to carry without bracing. I'm telling you this because if this goes wrong, if we lose this case, I don't know that I have another 8 months of rebuilding left in me. I don't know that I'd bother. The room was very still. Evelyn's expression did not shift to pity. He had been watching for it, ready to close off if he saw it. It didn't come. What came instead was something closer to recognition, the look of someone who understood the specific geography of that kind of exhaustion because they had their own version of it, mapped to different coordinates. "Then we don't lose," she said. "It might not be in our control." "More of it is in our control than you think." She picked her pen back up. "And the parts that aren't, we'll deal with those when we get there. I'm not going to tell you everything will work out fine because I don't know that. But I know that what we're building here," she gestured slightly at the papers, at the room, at something less tangible than either, "is worth defending. So that's what I'm doing." He had no answer for that. There wasn't a good answer. The words just settled into him the way warmth does after a long time in the cold, gradually, almost imperceptibly, and then all at once, in a way you couldn't unfeel. On the 38th day, Gerald Fitch came back. He came alone this time, which was somehow more unsettling than when he had come with the other two. He rode up to the gate in the middle of the afternoon when the storm had thinned to a mean drizzle, and he sat on his horse and called out for Rowan with the unhurried patience of a man who knew the person inside would eventually have to answer. Rowan stepped onto the porch. He had heard the horse 20 seconds before Fitch called out. Cole had risen from his spot without barking this time, just watching the door, which told Rowan something about the kind of alert the dog was registering. "Mr. Ashford," Fitch touched his hat brim, "I hope the winter's been treating you reasonably." "What do you want?" "The company wanted me to check in, see how you were progressing with your arrangements." The pleasantness was still there, but it had thinned slightly, less a smile now, and more the shape a smile leaves behind. 60 days is more time than it sounds, but people tend to leave things late and then the whole process gets unpleasant for everyone. "We're not making arrangements," Rowan said. Fitch's horse shifted under him. He steadied it with a slight adjustment of the reins, never taking his eyes off Rowan. "Mr. Ashford, I want to be direct with you, man to man." He said this with the tone of someone who had never been direct in his life, but had learned to announce it convincingly. "The company has considerable resources and considerable patience. The legal system in this territory, while I'm sure it feels distant to you out here, it tends to move in the direction of organized capital. That's just the nature of how things work. I'm not saying that's right or wrong. I'm saying it's true." "That's a lot of words," said a voice from behind Rowan. He didn't turn. He didn't need to. Evelyn had come to stand in the doorway, not behind him, but beside him, just at the edge of the doorframe, and her voice carried the particular quality of someone who had decided to be in the conversation. Fitch looked at her. Something moved in his expression. Surprise, maybe, or reassessment. "Ma'am," he said, "you said you wanted to be direct." Her arms were folded, not aggressively, the way you fold your arms when you are standing still and paying close attention. "So let me be direct as well. We're aware of the claim. We're aware of the timeline. And we're in the process of verifying the documentation." She paused. "All of the documentation?" The silence that followed lasted exactly 4 seconds. Rowan counted them without meaning to. Fitch's expression did not crack. He was too experienced for that. But something shifted behind his eyes. A recalculation, quick and controlled. The internal movement of a man who had just registered a variable he had not previously accounted for. "Well," he said, "I wish you luck with that." He picked up his reins. "I truly do, Mr. Ashford. I hope the next 22 days serve you well." He turned his horse and rode back through the drizzle without looking back. Rowan stood on the porch until the sound of hoofbeats faded. Then he said, without turning, "You didn't need to do that." "No," she agreed. "But I wanted him to know we weren't sitting here waiting." She paused. "Did I overstep?" He thought about it honestly. "No." "You would have told me." "Yes." "Good." She went back inside. He heard her sit down at the table and pick up her pen. He stood in the drizzle for another 30 seconds, watching the trail where Fitch had disappeared. He was thinking about what Fitch had said, organized capital, the direction things tend to move. And underneath the thinking, something else was happening that he would not have been able to name cleanly. Something that had been gradually building for 38 days without his permission, assembled out of morning coffee handed over without ceremony, and a shoulder bound with efficient hands, and 4 years of courthouse work that a husband had never once asked about, and a voice in a doorway that said, "We," without hesitation. He was not a man given to realizing things suddenly. Understanding arrived in him the way water works into limestone, slowly, over time, through repeated contact, and by the time you notice the change, the water has already been there a while. He went back inside. The letter from the Territorial Archive office arrived on the 44th day, carried by a postwriter who looked half frozen and deeply uninterested in conversation. Rowan signed for it and brought it inside without opening it, which was something he would not have done 6 weeks ago. 6 weeks ago, he would have stood in the cold and torn it open immediately because the only alternative was the particular agony of waiting while holding the thing in your hand. He set it on the table in front of Evelyn. She looked at it, then at him. Then she picked it up and opened it with a letter knife. Not hurrying, not performing calm, just moving at the pace of someone who had decided that how she handled the next 30 seconds mattered. She read it. He watched her face. He had gotten better at reading her face over the past 6 weeks, though it was still more work than it should have been. She ran a tight interior, kept most of the significant traffic below the surface. But he caught the moment her eyes stilled, the way they do when the mind stops moving and arrives somewhere. "It's here," she said quietly. "What is?" "The original filing record for this land parcel. The archive office confirmed the deed your father registered in 1867. She turned the letter so he could see. And they included a note from the senior archivist. He's seen at least 2 other requests for records on properties near Blackstone Valley in the past 4 months. Both came from a law firm in Cheyenne." She looked up. "The same firm representing Western Frontier Rail." "They've been preparing this." "For at least 4 months, probably longer." She set the letter down. They identified properties, fabricated prior claims, and waited for the right moment. Winter was strategic. People are isolated, communication is slow, they can't easily consult lawyers or access records. Her jaw had the slight set to it that he associated with her making a decision she had not quite verbalized yet. "They are very organized. And we have 3 discrepancies in a letter from an archive clerk. We have 3 verified discrepancies, a confirmed legitimate deed, a pattern of fraudulent claims across multiple counties, and..." She paused. "I've written to a man named Thomas Alderley." Rowan didn't know the name. He was the lead land surveyor for the Territorial Commission from 1858 to 1871, she said. He would have been personally responsible for the survey records during the period this fraudulent claim was supposedly filed. If anyone can confirm that the seal, the signature, and the filing date are impossible, it's him. "You wrote to him already." 3 weeks ago." He stared at her. "You didn't tell me." "I wasn't sure he was alive." A simple answer. Completely reasonable, infuriating in its completeness. "He would be in his late 70s. I sent the letter to his last known address in Fort Mercer and asked to be notified either way." She looked up. "I should have told you. I'm sorry. I didn't want to hand you a thread that might not go anywhere." "I'd rather know about the threads that don't go anywhere than not know they exist." She absorbed that. "All right, I'll remember that." "Has he written back?" "Not yet." 16 days left. He sat down across from her, and they both looked at the letter from the archive office, and the papers spread between them, and the list of discrepancies in her tight handwriting, and the room was quiet in the particular way it had become quiet over 44 days. Not the silence of 2 people with nothing to say, but the silence of 2 people who had stopped needing to fill the space between thoughts. "I keep thinking about the man in Dunmore County who died," Rowan said. Evelyn nodded once. She had been thinking about it too. He could tell. "If Fitch comes back, he'll come back. When he does, I don't want you on the porch." He said it not as an order but as a request, which was different, and she would know the difference. She considered it. He expected an argument, not a combative one, just the kind that said she didn't need protection. Instead, she said, "All right, but if the conversation becomes relevant to the case, I need to be able to hear it. Leave the window unlatched." "Done," he nodded. Outside, the drizzle had thickened back towards snow. The mountains were invisible behind their clouds. Somewhere in the barn, Patience coughed once, then settled. Cole got up from his spot by the stove, turned in a circle, and lay back down facing the door, ears forward. 16 days. The number sat between them on the table like a fifth piece of paper. Neither of them looked directly at it. But it was there, and they both knew it, and the knowing had the particular weight of something that had been carried long enough to leave a mark. Rowan reached across the table and straightened one of the pages in the stack. Not because it needed straightening, but because his hands needed to do something while his mind worked through what he would not say out loud. That whatever happened in 16 days, whatever the outcome of documents and courtrooms and men with leather satchels and practiced smiles, something had already changed that couldn't be reversed. Something had already been built here, in these 44 days, out of coffee and silence and shoulder wounds and letters to archive offices, and a voice in a doorway that said, "We," without hesitating. He didn't have the language for it. He wasn't sure the language existed. But Evelyn was already writing the next letter, her pen moving with that fast, pressured efficiency. And Cole was watching the door, and the stove was warm, and outside the snow was making its argument against the mountains the way it always had and always would. Indifferent and enormous, and ultimately unconcerned with any of it. The ranch was still his. For now, it was still his, and he was not facing it alone. Thomas Alderley's letter arrived on the 51st day. Rowan was in the barn when the post rider came through, and Evelyn received it at the door. She did not open it immediately. She set it on the table and waited for him to come in from the cold, which he did not know until he stepped inside and saw it sitting there, and saw her sitting across from it, with her hands folded and her expression doing that particular thing it did when she was holding herself still on purpose. He took off his coat, hung it on the peg by the door, washed his hands in the basin, sat down. She slid the letter across to him. "You open it," she said. He looked at her. That was not nothing. Evelyn did not surrender the opening of important letters lightly. He understood what she was doing without either of them having to say it. This was his land, his fight, originally. She was returning the moment to him. He picked it up and opened it. Thomas Alderley wrote in the cramped, slightly trembling script of a man whose hands had aged faster than his mind. The letter was 2 pages long. Rowan read it once quickly, and then again slowly, and by the second reading his jaw had set in the particular way it set when something confirmed what he had been afraid to fully believe. He set it down and pushed it back across to Evelyn. She read it. Her eyes moved steadily down the page, and then she turned to the second page and read that too. And when she finished, she sat back in her chair and exhaled once, a long, controlled exhale, and said nothing for a moment. "He was there," Rowan said. "He was the survey commissioner," she said. "He personally oversaw every land filing in this territory from 1858 through 1865. He says," she looked down at the letter again. "He says the seal design on documents from that period is something he could identify in his sleep. He designed the updated seal himself. The left-facing eagle was his specification. He put it into effect the first week of September 1859, and he has the original commission records to prove it." And the signature. H.W. Calloway didn't exist in an official capacity until March of 1863. Alderley says he appointed Calloway himself and remembers the date precisely because it was the same week his youngest son was born. She looked up. He says he is willing to travel to Blackstone Valley to testify. He's in his late 70s. I know. The journey from Fort Mercer in this weather, I know, Rowan. She said his name with the slight weight of someone choosing patience over frustration. He's offering. That's what matters right now. He picked up the letter again and read the last paragraph. Alderley had written, I have been aware for some time that certain corporate interests have been making use of fraudulent territorial documents in this region. I have reported my suspicions to the Land Office on 2 previous occasions and received no satisfactory response. If my testimony can be of service to a legitimate landowner against this practice, I consider it something I am obligated to provide, whatever the inconvenience to myself. Obligated. The word sat in Rowan's chest differently than he expected. We need a lawyer, he said. Yes. Fitch said no one in Caldwell's Creek would take the case. Fitch said that to discourage you. He didn't say it because it was necessarily true. She had already turned to a separate piece of paper, another list, this one with names. There's a man named Hargrove who practices out of Caldwell's Creek. He's older, semi-retired, handled mostly estate disputes and grazing rights in the last decade. Not a trial lawyer in the conventional sense. She paused. But he's not owned by the railroad either. I asked the postmaster about him when I went for supplies last week. Rowan stared at her. You went to town to ask about lawyers. I went to town for flour and salt, and I asked about lawyers while I was there. She looked at him without apology. It seemed practical. He almost said something about being informed of these things in advance. The almost argument rose and then subsided, because the truth was she was right. It was practical, and he had told her 2 weeks ago that he wanted to know about threads that might not go anywhere. This was a thread. She had found it. 9 days, he said instead. I know. They needed to move. Hargrove's office was above the feed store on the main street of Caldwell's Creek, accessible by an exterior staircase that had not been properly maintained since somewhere around 1874. Rowan went up first, testing each board. Evelyn followed without comment on the state of the stairs, which told him she had already noted it and decided it wasn't worth the breath. The man who opened the door to them was somewhere north of 65, with the kind of face that had been weathered into something almost geological. Deeply lined, permanently squinting, the skin of a man who had spent decades reading documents in poor light. He looked at Rowan first, then at Evelyn, and the look he gave Evelyn was the kind that recalibrated partway through, the way a person's look changes when they realize the person they're assessing is assessing them right back. Mr. Ashford, he said. Mrs. Ashford, come in. The office was dense with paper, not chaotic. There was a system to it, the kind of system only the person who built it could navigate. Hargrove cleared 2 chairs of their respective stacks and gestured for them to sit, and then sat himself across his desk and folded his hands in a way that communicated he was done with pleasantries. Tell me, he said. Evelyn told him. She laid it out in the order they had established over the past weeks. The original claim documents, the seal discrepancy, the Callaway signature, the timeline, the archive confirmation, Alderley's letter, and the pattern across Dunmore County. She spoke for 11 minutes without notes, which Rowan had not expected, and which Hargrove received with his eyes closed and his fingers laced together on the desk, only opening his eyes occasionally to look at one of the documents she slid across to him. When she finished, Hargrove sat forward and opened the claim documents himself, and looked at them with the specific attention of someone who knew what they were looking for. The eagle, he said. Right-facing, Evelyn confirmed. He made a sound in the back of his throat that wasn't quite a word. I've been watching Western Frontier Rail work this valley for 2 years. Filed a report with the Territorial Land Commission 18 months ago. They thanked me for my concern. He said the last sentence with a dry flatness that contained everything necessary about how that had gone. Will you take the case? Rowan asked. Hargrove looked at him, then at Evelyn, then back at the documents. I should tell you clearly that I haven't tried a property case in 11 years, he said. I should also tell you that whoever they bring to represent Western Frontier Rail will be younger than me, better resourced than me, and will have had considerably more sleep. He paused. I should also tell you that I find what this company has been doing to be about as close to plain theft as you can get while wearing a good coat and using longer words. Is that a yes? Rowan said. That's a yes with conditions attached. Hargrove turned to Evelyn. You understand land records. You understand them well, possibly better than me in the specifics of territorial filings. If you're willing to work with me on the documentation, help me build the presentation of evidence. I believe we have a case worth making. Evelyn said, I'm willing. Then we have 9 days to build it. He stood, which apparently signaled the productive part of the meeting had begun, and moved to one of the paper stacks along the wall. I'm going to need copies of everything you brought, and I need you to write out a clean narrative of every discrepancy in the order we'll present it. Dates, sources, contradictions. The judge in this district is a man named Callum Pierce. He is not easily impressed, he has no patience for theatrical presentation, and he responds to precision, so precision is what we give him. Pierce, Evelyn said, is he honest? Hargrove said it simply. Whatever else you might say about him, he's honest. In this territory, at this moment, that is the most important fact about any judge. Rowan looked at the wall of papers and the old lawyer moving through them with a focused economy that did not look like a man who had been semi-retired for a decade, and felt something in his chest that was not quite hope. Hope felt fragile, and he had learned to be careful with fragile things, but was something adjacent to it, something with weight to it, something that pushed back against the gravity of the past 9 weeks. "Mr. Hargrove," he said. The old man looked up. "Thank you." Hargrove waved it off with the efficiency of a man who found gratitude less useful than momentum. "Thank me in 10 days, he said. "Now, Mrs. Ashford, start with the seal." They worked in Hargrove's office until the light failed that first day. Then again the following morning, then 3 days in a row after that. Evelyn wrote the evidentiary narrative in 2 drafts. The first long and detailed, the second stripped to its essential architecture the way Hargrove required, each discrepancy stated once, precisely, with its source and its implication. Rowan handled the correspondence with Thomas Alderley, writing to confirm the travel arrangements and to ask, carefully, whether Alderley was certain about the journey. Alderley wrote back in 4 sentences. He was certain. He had made harder journeys for less important reasons. He would arrive 2 days before the hearing. He had the original commission records from 1859 in a trunk in his study and had been waiting for an occasion to use them. On the 6th day, Fitch came back. He came to Hargrove's office this time, not to the ranch, which told Rowan that someone in Caldwell's Creek had told someone in the railroad's employ that a lawyer had been retained. Small towns had long ears. This was not a surprise, exactly, but it was a confirmation of the shape of things. They were not operating in secret anymore, if they ever had been. Rowan and Evelyn were both in the office when Fitch walked in without knocking, a habit of his that Rowan had by now identified as deliberate rather than careless, a small performance of ownership over any space he entered. He looked around the office, registered the documents on the table, registered Hargrove at his desk, and arranged his expression into something Rowan could only describe as aggressively reasonable. "Mr. Hargrove," he said, "I didn't realize you were involved." "Apparently," Hargrove said, without looking up from what he was reading, "the company wanted me to make one more attempt at an amicable resolution before the hearing." Fitch set his hat on the edge of the desk, which none of them had invited. "The offer has been revised upward, considerably." He named a figure. The figure was, objectively, significant. Rowan heard it and felt the pull of it, not because he wanted the money, but because the body responds to the smell of an exit even when the mind has decided not to take it. He felt Evelyn, seated 2 feet to his left, go slightly still. "No," Rowan said. "Mr. Ashford, with that amount you could purchase comparable—" "There is no comparable land," Rowan said. The words came out flat and without heat, which was worse than anger, and he knew it. "My father put 30 years into that ground. I've put 31 more. You can't buy what that means with a figure." He looked at Fitch with the direct, unceremonious look of a man who has moved past the point of performance. "And I think you know the claim is fraudulent. I think you've known it this whole time. So let's stop pretending this is a business conversation." Something moved through Fitch's expression quickly. Not guilt, exactly, but something in the family of guilt. Irritation, maybe. The irritation of a man who prefers his dishonesty to stay in the vocabulary of business, where it has better costumes. "The hearing is in 3 days, Fitch said. He picked up his hat. "I hope for your sake, Mr. Ashford, that whatever you have is sufficient." He looked at Evelyn then, and the look was not threatening. It was more unsettling than threatening. It was assessing, the look of a man recalibrating a variable he had initially underestimated. "Ma'am." He left. Hargrove put down what he was reading and said, "He's not as confident as he wants you to think." "I know," Evelyn said. "The revised offer tells you they're concerned about what we have. If they were certain of their position, they'd let the court handle it. They're offering money because they want this to go away before it becomes a matter of public record." He folded his hands. "Which means the documents they're presenting are vulnerable and they know it." "Or they're offering money because they always do," Rowan said, "and it usually works." Also possible. Hargrove stood, which is why we don't stop working. Thomas Alderley arrived on the afternoon of the day before the hearing. He was smaller than Rowan had pictured. Not frail, but compact. The kind of man who had carried himself carefully for a long time and still moved with a deliberateness that read as dignity rather than age. He had white hair and eyes so sharp and clear that they seemed to belong to a much younger version of him, and he carried a leather satchel so worn it was nearly smooth, and a trunk that took 2 men to carry up Hargrove's stairs. The trunk contained 34 years of territorial commission records, organized by year and indexed in Alderley's own hand. Evelyn stood in the middle of Hargrove's office and looked at the open trunk and said absolutely nothing for a long moment. "Mrs. Ashford," Alderley said with the slight ceremony of a man from an older era of manners, "your letters were very thorough." "Thank you for coming, Mr. Alderley," she said. "How was the journey?" "Cold," he said, "and worth it." They spent that evening going through Alderley's records with a focused, almost reverent attention. Hargrove asking questions, Alderley answering with precise citations from memory and then confirming with the physical documents, Evelyn cross-referencing against the fraudulent claim papers, Rowan listening and tracking the larger architecture of what was being assembled. By 9 o'clock, they had identified 6 distinct documentable impossibilities in Western Frontier Rail's claim. The seal, the Callaway signature, a third signature that appeared on page 7 and belonged to a man who had died 4 months before the filing date, a parcel number format that didn't come into use until 1864, ink that showed no oxidation consistent with documents of the claimed age, and a boundary description that referenced a creek that hadn't been formally surveyed or named until 1863. 6 impossibilities. Any one of them, alone, might be explainable. All 6 together were not an error. They were a pattern, and a pattern was an argument. Hargrove sat back in his chair at the end of the night and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "All right," he said. "I think we have something." "We have the truth," Evelyn said. She said it without drama, just naming what they had. "The truth, yes." Hargrove lowered his eyes. "Now we need to present it to a room full of people where the other side will be doing everything they can to make it look complicated. The truth is only as useful as the jury's ability to follow it." "There's no jury," Rowan said. "Pierce decides." "Pierce decides. Which means I need to present this to a man who reads faster than most people think and has a very low tolerance for being led." Hargrove looked at Evelyn. "When I ask you to present the seal comparison tomorrow, I'll be ready. You'll be speaking in the capacity of a material witness with documented expertise. I'll establish your background with the circuit judge's records office before you begin." "I understand." Rowan looked at her then, across the table, across the stacked papers, and the open trunk and the low lamp that had burned down over the course of the evening. She looked tired. Not defeated tired, but the way a person looks when they have pushed themselves past their ordinary reserves and found something underneath. Her hair had come partly loose from its pins somewhere in the last hour, and she hadn't bothered with it, and there was ink on the side of her right hand that she hadn't noticed. He would not have been able to say what he felt in that moment with any precision. It was too layered for precision. It was the admixture of things. Respect and something warmer than respect. The specific tenderness a person develops for someone they have watched work hard under pressure. And underneath those things, the older and more complicated thing that lived in the part of him that had been deciding, quietly, without announcement, over the past 60 days, that this woman was not a practical arrangement. She looked up and caught him looking. Her expression asked a question. "Nothing," he said. "Just, thank you." She held his gaze for a beat. "We haven't won yet," she said. "I know. Stop thanking people for things that haven't happened." He almost smiled. "All right." She looked back down at the documents. He looked back down at his. Hargrove, who had been watching both of them with the peripheral attention of a man who had seen a great deal of human behavior in his 6 decades, said nothing and refilled his coffee. The morning of the hearing arrived gray and cold, the kind of morning that does not offer encouragement and does not try to. Rowan was up before light, which was unremarkable. What was unremarkable in a different way was that Evelyn was up before him, standing at the stove, dressed already, with her hair pinned back and her coat hung by the door, and a cup of coffee on the table waiting for him. He sat down and drank it and said nothing, and neither did she, and the silence was not the silence of two people with nothing to say. Cole was watching them both from his spot by the fire. The dog had a capacity for reading the atmosphere of a room that Rowan had long since stopped being surprised by. He sat very still with his head on his paws, tracking both of them, and did not ask to go outside or move toward his bowl, just watched. "If this doesn't go the way we want," Rowan said, "don't. I need to say it." She looked at him across the table with an expression that was not impatience but was something firmer than comfort. "Then say it quickly. If it doesn't go our way, I want you to know that what you did, what you've done, it mattered, regardless of the outcome. I need you to know that." She looked at him for a moment. Something crossed her face that she didn't immediately control, brief and real, and gone in a second into that careful interior she kept. "It's going to go our way," she said. "Evelyn, I'm not being optimistic." She stood and picked up her coat. "I'm being accurate. We have 6 documented impossibilities, a surveyor who helped design the original seal, and a judge with a reputation for hating fraud more than he hates railroad money." She put her coat on. "So, finish your coffee and let's go." He finished his coffee. They went. Upos. The Caldwell's Creek Courthouse was a single-story building that smelled of pine boards and old lamp oil, and the particular staleness of a room where contentious things had been decided over many years. It seated perhaps 60 people, and by the time Rowan and Evelyn arrived with Hargrove and Alderley, it was nearly full. This surprised him. He had not expected an audience. What he had not accounted for was that Western Frontier Rail had been working this valley for 2 years, and that the families who ran cattle on the mountain's lower slopes and the homesteaders who had settled the eastern ridgeline and the small cluster of merchants in Caldwell's Creek, who depended on all of them for their livelihood, had been watching the railroad's movements with the quiet dread of people who understood that what happened to the Ashford Ranch would not stop there. He recognized faces in the rows, neighbors, people he had done business with, people who had delivered casseroles to his door in the weeks after Clara died, and whom he had thanked with a brevity that probably read as coldness, but was in fact the maximum he had been capable of at the time. They were here, watching, with the particular expression of people who had not allowed themselves to hope too openly because the cost of disappointed hope in hard country was too high. Evelyn sat beside him at the table and arranged the documents in the order she and Hargrove had established, and if she noticed the room, the number of people, the weight of what their presence implied, she didn't show it. On the other side of the room, Western Frontier Rail's legal team occupied the opposing table. There were 3 of them, young, pressed, with the look of men who had been trained in Eastern courtrooms and wore that training the way they wore their suits, as evidence of a world where things were decided before the conversation started. The lead attorney's name, Rowan would learn shortly, was Prescott. He was perhaps 40, with the confident stillness of a man who had never lost a case he considered important. He looked at Hargrove across the room with an expression of polite professional neutrality that contained underneath it a faint quality of relief. An old, semi-retired country lawyer. Of course, he had not evidently been told much about the woman sitting beside Rowan Ashford. Judge Callum Pierce entered from the side door and the room stood and the hearing began, and what happened in that room over the next several hours would be talked about in Caldwell's Creek for a long time, not because it was dramatic in the theatrical sense, but because it was something rarer, a room full of people watching the truth get told clearly, in order, without apology, by people who had done the work to find it and had the character to stand behind it when it cost them something. Hargrove opened. He was brief, which surprised the room. He said, "There are 6 reasons this claim is fraudulent, and we will demonstrate each of them in sequence, beginning with the seal." Prescott objected twice in the first 10 minutes. Pierce sustained neither objection. Then Hargrove said, "I'd like to call Evelyn Ashford as a material witness." And Evelyn stood. She walked to the front of the room and turned to face the judge and the gathered people of Caldwell's Creek and the 3 attorneys in their pressed suits, and she held the fraudulent claim document in one hand and a copy of a legitimate territorial filing from 1860 in the other, and she began to speak with the clear, measured precision of someone who has spent years making complicated things understandable because her job required it and she was good at her job. She did not look at Rowan during any of this. She looked at the judge. Rowan looked at her. The room was quiet, in the way rooms get quiet when something true is being said, and everyone in them can feel it. Prescott began his cross-examination 12 minutes into her testimony and found, within the first 4 questions, that he had made a significant miscalculation. He had prepared for an emotional witness, a rancher's wife, corroborating her husband's claim. He had not prepared for a woman who had spent 4 years in a circuit judge's records office and could cite the specific section of the territorial code that governed seal design changes and the precise date it took effect because she had helped file documents under that code and remembered, with the kind of memory that comes from work done carefully over time, exactly what the original commission specifications said. By the end of her testimony, Prescott had stopped cross-examining and was writing something on a piece of paper that he passed to the younger attorney on his left, who read it and looked briefly, unguardedly uncomfortable. Then Thomas Alderley took the stand, and the room, if possible, got even quieter. He was 78 years old, and he spoke like a man who had been waiting for this particular conversation for some time. And he laid out the history of the territorial seal with the quiet authority of someone who had lived that history at its center. And when he opened the trunk and produced the original 1859 commission record with the design specification in his own handwriting from 66 years ago, something happened in that courtroom that Rowan would remember for the rest of his life. Prescott stood to object. Pierce raised one hand without looking at him, and Prescott sat back down. In the back row, someone exhaled. A sound, not quite a word. Something closer to the sound a person makes when they have been holding their breath for a very long time and have finally, carefully, permitted themselves to stop. Outside, the gray morning was turning toward something that might, by afternoon, become light. Prescott did not cross-examine Thomas Alderley. He conferred with the 2 younger attorneys at his table for approximately 90 seconds, and then he stood and said, with the controlled evenness of a man swallowing something bitter in front of an audience, that the defense had no questions for this witness at this time. Pierce looked at him over the edge of his glasses with an expression that communicated without words that he found this decision both noted and unsurprising. Alderley made his way back to his seat with the deliberate care of a man whose knees had earned their complaint, and when he passed the row where Rowan and Evelyn sat, he gave Evelyn a single nod. Not congratulatory, just acknowledging, the nod of one professional to another that said, "The work was good." Evelyn nodded back. Hargrove stood and said he wished to present the remaining 4 documented discrepancies in the claim, and what followed was 40 minutes of methodical, unhurried dismantling that Rowan would later have difficulty describing to anyone who had not been in the room, not because it was complicated, but because it had a quality to it that resisted easy summary. The quality of watching something constructed over a long time with great care finally fully revealed for what it was. Not dramatic, just true and thorough, and presented in the precise sequence that made each new fact land with the weight of the ones that had come before it. The parcel number format that didn't exist until 1864. Hargrove set the document beside 3 legitimate filings from 1861 and 1862 and let the difference speak. The third signature belonging to a man who had died in June of 1861, 4 months before the document's supposed filing date of October of that year. Hargrove presented the death record, obtained from the county clerk in Dunmore, and let Pierce read it himself. The ink oxidation, or rather, the absence of it. A man named Beckett, a retired document examiner who had driven 6 hours from the county seat after Evelyn wrote to him 3 weeks prior, described in plain language the chemical process by which iron gall ink ages and the ways in which this document's ink did not reflect that process, and what that meant about when the document had actually been created. The boundary description referencing a creek that had not been formally surveyed or named until 1863. Alderley confirmed this from his seat without needing to return to the stand. Pierce asked him directly, and Alderley answered directly, and the court reporter's pen kept moving. 6 impossibilities, laid out in sequence, each one individually explainable by error, all 6 together explainable by nothing except intent. Prescott attempted a redirect after Hargrove finished. He was composed and technically skilled, and he worked hard to reframe each discrepancy as clerical error administrative inconsistency, record-keeping failure across multiple offices over multiple decades. He was not unconvincing. Rowan sat and listened and felt the particular anxiety of watching a skilled person try to make a clear thing murky, because murkiness was often enough. Juries had hung on less, and judges were human, and the railroad had money and time and the institutional patience of an organization that could afford to lose one battle and return for the next. But Pierce was watching Prescott with an expression that was not hostile, exactly, just increasingly tired in a specific way. The tiredness of a man who has seen a particular kind of argument many times before and has a very low tolerance for it when the evidence does not support it. When Prescott concluded, Pierce removed his glasses and set them on the desk in front of him and sat for a moment with his hands flat on the desk. The room held its breath. "Mr. Prescott," Pierce said. His voice was not loud, but it had a quality of occupying the room completely. "Your argument requires me to accept that 6 separate clerical errors, each of a distinctly different nature, each from a different source and a different time period, each discoverable only through detailed cross-reference with records from multiple distinct offices, all occurred in the same document. Is that correct?" Prescott said, "The territorial record system during that period was not—" "Is that the argument you are making?" Pierce said. "Not a question. A request for clarification with a specific answer expected." A pause. "Yes, Your Honor." Pierce put his glasses back on. "I see." He looked down at the documents on his desk and turned 3 pages. The room was so quiet that the sound of the paper was audible. "I'd like to ask Mr. Alderley one additional question, with counsel's permission." Hargrove said, "Of course." Prescott said nothing, which was itself an answer. Pierce looked at Alderley. "Mr. Alderley, in your professional experience as Territorial Survey Commissioner, which spanned, if I have this correctly, 17 years, did you ever encounter a legitimate land claim that contained errors of the type and variety we have reviewed today?" Alderley did not hesitate. "No, Your Honor, I did not." "Thank you," Pierce said. "You may step down." Alderley, who had not moved toward the stand, inclined his head with quiet dignity from his seat. Pierce made a note on the paper before him. The scratch of his pen was the only sound in the room for 8 seconds. Rowan counted them the way he had been counting things since the morning Evelyn arrived. Not obsessively, just the quiet, specific attention of a man who had learned that seconds had weight. "I'm going to take a 30-minute recess," Pierce said, "before delivering my ruling." He stood, and the room stood with him, and he went through the side door, and the moment it closed behind him, the room exhaled all at once like something had been physically released. Rowan did not leave the courthouse during the recess. He sat at the table and drank the water someone put in front of him and looked at the wall above the judge's bench. Hargrove had gone to speak with the court clerk about procedural matters. Alderley had been guided to a seat in the front row by the bailiff, who seemed to have appointed himself Alderley's attendant sometime during the morning without anyone formally arranging it. Evelyn sat beside Rowan. She had her hands on the table, both of them, flat, not folded. She was looking at the same section of wall he was looking at, which he doubted she was actually seeing. On the other side of the room, Prescott and his 2 colleagues were having a conversation in very low voices. Whatever they were saying, their body language had the compressed inward quality of people recalibrating, not panicking, but adjusting, making plans for the possibility that the outcome they had arrived here expecting was not the outcome they were going to leave with. Rowan said quietly, "You wrote to Beckett 3 weeks ago." "The ink man. 3 weeks ago. Document examiner, and yes. How many people did you write to that you didn't tell me about?" She considered this with apparent honesty. "Beckett, Alderley, which you knew, the Dunmore County clerk for the death record, you knew about that too. A woman in the territorial capital who I thought might have access to the original Seal Commission records, but she didn't write back, so Alderley covered it." A pause. "That might be all. Might be. Is all." Another pause. "I think." He looked at her. She was still looking at the wall. "I'm not angry," he said. "I know. I want to be able to know about things when you're doing them. I told you what I found. I should have told you what I was looking for. She turned her head and looked at him directly. That's the gap. I'll mind it better. It was the closest thing to an apology she offered when she believed she had done the right thing, but acknowledged the manner could have been different, and he had come to understand that this was the particular shape of how she handled being wrong in a limited way. Not elaborate, just precise and without performance. All right, he said. They went back to looking at the wall. From behind them, someone in the gallery coughed. Someone else shifted in their seat. The room had the specific tension of 60 people trying to sit still when stillness is not what their bodies want, and Rowan was aware of it at the edges. The accumulated waiting of everyone who had come here with something at stake that was not their name on the deed but was bound to it anyway. Whatever he decides, Rowan said, don't. Evelyn, Rowan. She said his name with a firmness that was not unkind. Whatever he decides is not going to change what we built to get here. Nothing undoes that. She looked at the table. But I am not interested in preparing myself for the worst outcome while I'm still in the room where the better one is possible. So, she straightened the documents in front of her by approximately 1 millimeter, which they did not need. Let's wait for the man to come back and tell us. He did not say anything else. She was right. She was frequently right, which he had spent the first 2 weeks of their marriage finding faintly irritating and had since revised his position on completely. The 30 minutes passed the way 30 minutes passes in a room full of people who are waiting for something important. Slowly, at the front end, and then suddenly gone. Ooh. Pierce returned and the room stood, and Pierce sat, and they all sat, and Pierce arranged the documents on his desk in a specific order that nobody in the room could interpret, and put his glasses on and looked at them over the rims for a moment. I've reviewed the evidence submitted by both parties this morning, he said, in addition to the documentary record brought by Mr. Alderley and the testimony of Mrs. Ashford and Mr. Beckett. He paused. And I want to say something before I deliver my ruling that I do not often say in this courtroom. The room waited. This court has, over the past 2 years, seen 3 land claim disputes in this valley involving Western Frontier Rail Company. In 2 of those cases, the landowners accepted settlement offers before the hearing date. In the 3rd, the case was dismissed on procedural grounds before the merits were reached. He looked at the documents in front of him. I was not satisfied with any of those outcomes. But in each case, what was brought before me was insufficient to establish fraud rather than dispute. What has been brought before me today is different in kind. Prescott shifted in his seat. The evidence presented by counsel for the defendant establishes, to this court's satisfaction, that the land claim filed by Western Frontier Rail Company against the Ashford property contains 6 distinct documentary impossibilities, each of which has been verified against independent primary sources, and each of which is inconsistent with the claim having been legitimately generated at the time and by the person stated on its face. Pierce's voice had not changed in volume or pace. It had the quality of a man who had decided what he was going to say before he came back into the room and was simply delivering it now with the precision it deserved. That is not error. Error does not have 6 faces pointing in the same direction. What this evidence describes is fabrication, and I am satisfied beyond any reasonable doubt that this court is looking at a fraudulent document. The word landed in the room, fraudulent, not disputed, not contested, fraudulent. Someone in the gallery made a sound, not quite a word, not quite anything, just the involuntary sound of a human body releasing tension it had been holding for months. The land claim filed by Western Frontier Rail Company against the property registered to Rowan Ashford in Blackstone Valley is hereby dismissed with prejudice, Pierce said. The defendant's title stands as registered. Western Frontier Rail Company is hereby prohibited from filing any further claim against this property or any portion thereof. He took off his glasses. Furthermore, he looked at Prescott directly. I am referring this matter to the Territorial Attorney General's Office for investigation of potential fraud, forgery, and conspiracy to deprive legal landowners of property through fabricated documentation. This referral will include the documentation submitted today, as well as the records of the 3 prior cases in this district that I have referenced. He put his glasses back on. Mr. Prescott, I want to be clear that this referral is not directed at you personally. But I want Western Frontier Rail Company's leadership to understand that this court considers today's evidence sufficient to warrant a criminal inquiry, and I intend to ensure that inquiry takes place." Prescott stood. "Your Honor, on behalf of Western Frontier Rail—" "We're done, Mr. Prescott." Pierce's voice did not rise. It didn't need to. "Court is adjourned." He stood and the room stood with him, and when he went through the side door this time, the sound it made closing was ordinary. A door closing, nothing more. But the room did not immediately sit back down. People stood and looked at each other, and the particular noise of 60 people moving from held breath to released breath filled the space in a way that was not celebration exactly, not yet, but was something true and warm and collective in the way that only happens when people who have been waiting a long time find out the waiting has been worth it. Rowan sat. He sat because his legs did not feel entirely reliable, and because the room around him was moving and he needed a moment of stillness inside the movement. He put his hands flat on the table, flat, the way Evelyn had been sitting before the recess, and looked at the grain of the wood and let himself feel the size of what had just happened without trying to organize it into anything. He was aware, through this, of Evelyn standing beside him. She had risen with the rest of the room. She was standing with her arms at her sides, not performing anything, just present. And when he became aware of her looking down at him, he looked up. Her face was doing something he hadn't seen before. Not many things had gotten through that careful interior in the 10 weeks he had known her. Small things, controlled things, flickers that were there and gone. This was not a flicker. She was looking at him with an expression that had several things in it simultaneously, none of them simple, and she was not trying to control it, which was itself the most significant thing, because Evelyn always tried to control it. He stood. They were the same height, very nearly. He had not quite registered that before, or had registered it and not held on to it. He said, "Thank you." She said, "Stop thanking me." "I mean it." "I know you do." She looked at him steadily. "You're welcome." She looked away first toward Hargrove, who was accepting handshakes from several men Rowan vaguely recognized. "We should go thank Hargrove." "In a minute." She looked back. He didn't have a next sentence prepared. There was something there, a sentence that needed saying, that had been needing saying for some time, that lived in the category of things he had been carrying below the surface the way water carries things. But the room was full of people, and Hargrove was coming toward them now, and the moment reorganized itself before he could find the right shape for what was in it. Hargrove reached them and shook Rowan's hand and then, somewhat formally, extended his hand to Evelyn, who took it. "Well done," Hargrove said to her specifically. "You built the case," she said. "You found the thread." He said it simply, as a statement of record. "I've been practicing law in this territory for 38 years, and I have never seen a material witness walk into a courtroom with that quality of preparation. Wherever you learned to read a document, you learned it right." "I learned it because someone needed the work done, and I was willing to do it," she said. "That's usually how it goes." Hargrove looked at her for a moment with the evaluating attention of a man who has spent a career reading people. "If you ever find yourself looking for a different kind of work," he said, "my door's at the top of those stairs." "I'll remember that," she said. He nodded and turned to speak with Alderley, and Evelyn watched him go, and Rowan watched Evelyn watch him go, and when she turned back she found him still looking. "What?" she said. "Nothing." He picked up his coat from the back of the chair. "I'm glad you came." She was quiet for a beat. "What do you mean?" "On the train. I'm glad you came." He said it simply. Not as a declaration, not yet, not in this room full of people, but as the thing it was, true, direct, and requiring no ornamentation. "I didn't expect—" He stopped. "I didn't know what it would be. I didn't expect it to be this." She held his gaze. The room moved around them both. "Neither did I," she said quietly. That was all. It was sufficient. The sentence between them had its own weight, and it didn't need anything added. They both put on their coats. Outside the courthouse, the gray morning had done what Evelyn had predicted that morning. It had moved toward light, not dramatically, not the kind of light that announces itself, Just the ordinary improvement of a morning that had been overcast and then wasn't, the clouds thinning from the west in the way mountain weather sometimes relented without ceremony after a long effort. Several of the men from the gallery found Rowan on the courthouse steps. His neighbor Calhoun, who ran cattle on the ridge to the north, shook his hand and said only, "Good," in the way people say things when they've been worried for a long time and the resolution has left them with more feeling than words. A woman named Mrs. Driscoll, who owned the only dry goods store in Caldwell's Creek, and who had sent Rowan a pie the week after Clara died that he had eaten mechanically without tasting it, pressed Evelyn's hand between both of hers and said, "You did something today, young woman." And Evelyn, who was not particularly young and knew it, said, "Thank you, Mrs. Driscoll," with a warmth that was not performed. Alderley found them before they reached the wagon. He walked carefully on the courthouse steps. Rowan instinctively moved to offer an arm, but the old man's posture communicated, without aggression, that he was navigating under his own power. He stopped in front of Evelyn. "May I ask you something?" he said. "Of course." "How did you know to look at the seal?" "That specifically. Most people looking at that document would not have known there was anything to look at." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "I handled thousands of territorial filings over 4 years," she said. "When you've handled that many documents, legitimate ones, you develop a sense for what they should feel like. The same way a person who has worked in a kitchen for a long time can taste something and know immediately that an ingredient is wrong before they know which one." She paused. "It felt wrong. So I looked." Alderley nodded slowly. "That is exactly right," he said. "That is exactly what expertise is, and most people never understand it." He looked at her with those sharp, clear eyes that belonged to a younger version of him. "I am 78 years old, Mrs. Ashford. I have been waiting for 2 years to have this conversation with someone who had both the knowledge and the will to act on it. I'm glad it was you." He extended his hand and she shook it, and then he turned and Hargrove materialized at his elbow to help him navigate the steps toward the waiting carriage. And Rowan and Evelyn were left standing in the thin, tentative morning light with the courthouse behind them and the wagon and the road home ahead. Rowan said, "We should get back. The horses." "Yes. Patience needs checking. That cough hasn't entirely cleared." "I know. I've been adding the pine oil to her water." He looked at her. "Since when?" 2 weeks ago. I didn't mention it because it didn't seem worth mentioning." He almost laughed. It came out more breath than sound, but it was real. "Evelyn?" "What?" "You have to tell me things." "It was just the horse." "Tell me things about the horse." She looked at him with an expression that contained, if he was reading it correctly, the approximate equivalent of an eye roll contained within the framework of someone who did not actually roll their eyes. "Fine. I'll tell you about the horse." "Thank you." "She's better, by the way. The cough." "Good." They walked to the wagon. The street of Caldwell's Creek was going about its business. A delivery cart, 2 women talking outside the post office, a dog tracking something along the base of the feed store wall with the focused obliviousness of a dog. The ordinary world, doing its ordinary things, unaware that something had been saved this morning that the ordinary world often lost. Rowan helped Evelyn up to the wagon bench. Not because she couldn't manage it, she was perfectly capable of managing it, and they both knew it. He did it because he wanted to do something with his hands that was in the direction of her, and this was available, and she let him, which was its own kind of language. He climbed up on his side and gathered the reins. "Fitch," Evelyn said. He had been thinking the same thing. "He left before Pierce finished the ruling." "I saw." "He'll report to whoever runs the company, whatever that referral to the Attorney General's office actually produces." "It'll take time," she said. "These things always take time." "And the other properties they've gone after. One fight at a time." She said it not as a dismissal, but as a genuine organizational principle. "We did what we could do today. Tomorrow there might be more to do, but today is today." He looked at her. The particular quality of her face in that light, the tiredness in it, the ink still faintly there on the side of her right hand that she apparently never had noticed, the way her coat sat slightly uneven because the left button was the wrong size and had been since she arrived and she kept meaning to fix it and hadn't. All of it felt, in that moment, Less like something he was observing and more like something that was simply part of the landscape he lived in. The interior landscape, the one that mattered. He clicked to the horses, and the wagon moved. They were perhaps 10 minutes outside of town, in the stretch where the road narrowed and the tree line came close on both sides, and the mountains began to assert themselves against the sky, when Evelyn said without particular setup, "I meant what I said. On the steps. I didn't know what this would be." He kept his eyes on the road. "Neither did I." "I came here with practical expectations," she said. "A working arrangement, something survivable." A pause. "I didn't account for She stopped. "For what?" She was quiet for a moment. He let it be quiet. He was a patient man with silence. It was almost the first thing she had learned about him. "For finding out that someone can surprise you," she said finally. "At this age, in this kind of place. I thought I knew most of what there was to know about what people were capable of." She looked out at the trees. "You're more than I expected." It was not a romantic sentence in the conventional sense. It was more serious than that. It had the weight of a thing said by someone who had revised a foundational belief based on evidence, which is the hardest kind of revision there is. He said, "You're more than I prepared myself for." She looked at him. "Is that good?" "Yes," he said. "It's good." The road opened up ahead of them, and the mountains came fully into view, enormous and unhurried and white-capped still, already beginning to hold the first faint warmth of a light that was choosing today to show up. The horses found their pace. Cole, who had been allowed into the wagon bed that morning as a particular dispensation and who had spent the entire hearing asleep against Alderley's satchel and been entirely unashamed of this fact, stood up in the bed behind them and put his nose into the wind coming off the ridge. Rowan's shoulder had stopped aching. He realized this somewhere in the middle of the drive home. The shoulder that Evelyn had bound 11 weeks ago and that had been his constant low-grade companion since the fence post incident had, somewhere between the courthouse and the open road, settled into something that was not pain. He would not have been able to say when it had stopped, exactly. Only that it had. That seemed, in some way, he couldn't have articulated precisely, like the right thing for it to do. The cabin came into view as the afternoon light began its long western lean, and it looked the way it always looked from this distance. Functional, small, a shelter at the edge of a large and indifferent wilderness. But Evelyn had put curtains in the window sometime in the 6th week that he hadn't asked about and hadn't commented on. Practical curtains, nothing decorative, just cloth to keep the cold from getting in at the gap around the frame. And from the road he could see the pale edge of them from a quarter-mile out. And that small pale edge had the effect that small things sometimes have when they have landed in exactly the right place. He pulled the wagon to a stop at the gate and set the brake, and Evelyn climbed down before he could offer his hand this time, old habit returning, or perhaps just impatience, and turned back to look at him from the ground. "Well," she said. "Well," he said. Neither of them moved immediately toward the cabin. This was unusual. They were practical people. There was a horse to tend, and a fire that had been banked since morning, and a dog who had jumped from the wagon and was already investigating the perimeter of the yard with the focused efficiency of an animal returning to territory. But neither of them moved, and the afternoon light was doing what it does in the mountains when it decides to commit. Long and golden and very clear, the kind of light that shows everything plainly and makes nothing look worse than it is. And Rowan Ashford stood on his side of the wagon with his hand still on the brake, and looked at his wife, standing in his yard, at the end of the most important day either of them had spent in a long time. "Come on," she said, and turned toward the cabin. He released the brake, climbed down, followed. Behind him the gate swung back on its hinge with the small, familiar sound it had made 10,000 times, indifferent as the mountains to what had happened today and what it meant. Completely unaware that the ground it marked the border of had just been saved by a woman who had arrived 11 weeks ago with a worn suitcase and 4 honest sentences and a memory for document seals that had turned out to matter more than anyone standing in that courtroom could have predicted. The gate swung shut. The ranch held its ground under the settling light, the same as it had always held, the same as it would continue to hold. For the first time in a very long time, that fact felt like something more than survival. The morning after the hearing, Rowan fixed the west porch boards. He had been meaning to do it since October. The wood had been soft and giving underfoot since the first hard freeze, and twice he had nearly put a boot through the third board from the door, and both times he had noted it mentally and kept moving because there was always something more urgent and the porch could wait. It had waited through the entire winter. It had waited through Gerald Fitch and 60 days in a courtroom and all of it. He fixed it the morning after the hearing because he woke up, and the first thought in his head was not the railroad and not the Attorney General's referral and not what Prescott might do next. The first thought was the porch boards, and it occurred to him, pulling on his boots in the gray pre-dawn, that this was what it felt like to have your mind back. When the thing that has been consuming all available space finally moves, and the ordinary things, the boards, the fence post, the hay that needs rotating in the east section of the barn, rush back in to fill the room. The ordinary things had been waiting patiently, and they were owed some attention. He was on the third board when Evelyn came out with coffee. She looked at the boards, looked at him, handed him the cup, and went back inside without comment. He drank the coffee and kept working, and the morning was cold but not bitter, the cold of a season considering its exit rather than its dominance, and the mountains in the distance were doing what they did in early spring when the light changed angle, showing you things you couldn't see in winter, the rock faces and ridge lines that the flat gray light had hidden for months. He was on the fifth board when he thought about Clara, not with the weight it used to have, with something more like acknowledgement, the way you acknowledge a scar when you catch sight of it in a certain light. It's there. It happened. The tissue that formed over it is different from what was there before, but it's tissue, and it holds. He had loved Clara in the way of a young man who had never been shown that love could take more than one form, straightforwardly, completely, with the innocent arrogance of a person who believes that what they have is the only version of what it can be. He had not been wrong to love her that way. He had not been wrong to grieve her the way he had, even when the grief became something that ate rather than mourned. He had been a man who didn't have the vocabulary for the size of what happened, and had done with it what men in that position generally do, carried it in silence until it became the heaviest thing in the room. Evelyn had not replaced any of that. She wasn't the answer to Clara, and she would have said so herself, clearly, if anyone had been foolish enough to suggest it. She was a different thing entirely. The way the east pasture was a different thing from the north pasture. Same land, same sky, same general purpose, but different soil and different light, and you planted different things in it, and it gave you back different things in return. He finished the sixth board and stood on the porch and tested his weight on each one in sequence. They held. It was a small thing. It was also the kind of small thing that, accumulated over time, is what a life is actually made of. The letter from the Territorial Attorney General's office arrived 6 weeks after the hearing, on a morning in late April when the first real warmth had come to the valley, not the apologetic warmth of early March that retreated every third day, but the committed warmth of a season that had made up its mind. Rowan read it at the table and then passed it to Evelyn without comment, because she would want to read it herself, and his summary of it would not be sufficient. The Attorney General's office had opened a formal investigation into Western Frontier Rail Company's land acquisition practices in Blackstone Valley and 3 adjacent counties. The investigation would examine 14 property claims filed by the company over the past 3 years. 3 senior officers of the company had been named in the preliminary inquiry. Gerald Fitch was not among the named officers, which told Rowan something about Fitch's actual position in the organizational hierarchy. He was an instrument, not an architect, which was both a lesser and a sadder thing to be. Evelyn read the letter twice. Then she set it down and picked up her coffee. 14 claims, she said, in 4 counties. The 2 families in Dunmore who vacated. She said it not as a question. If the investigation finds what we think it'll find, they may be able to recover their properties. She looked at the letter again. Or compensation at minimum, depending on what the company's legal structure looks like and whether they've transferred the titles. Hargrove will know. I already wrote to him. Rowan looked at her over his cup. She looked back. Yesterday. When the letter came, I wrote to Hargrove asking about the legal mechanisms for property recovery in fraud cases. A pause. I was going to tell you. When? Now. I'm telling you now. He set his cup down. He should by any reasonable measure have found this infuriating. The persistent habit of acting first and informing second, the slightly too fast movement of her mind from problem to action that occasionally left him reading the trail rather than walking beside her. He knew this about himself, that he had grown up in a household where a man's knowledge of his own affairs was a matter of basic dignity, and that this was a value he held genuinely, and not just out of pride. He also had known for some time, in the accumulating way he knew things, that Evelyn's forward motion was not a failure to include him. It was the particular shape of a mind that had spent years being the only one doing the work, the only one who noticed, the only one who acted. Habits of necessity. They didn't dissolve in 11 weeks, or 20, or probably ever entirely. They adjusted. They got edges worn off them by consistent, patient contact with another person who was paying attention. He was paying attention. "Tell me when you send letters," he said. "Not before, if the timing doesn't work, but when." "All right," she said. Just that. No argument, no qualification. The clean acknowledgement of a person who is capable of learning a thing when it is said to them directly. "Thank you," he said. She nodded and looked back at the Attorney General's letter, and they finished their coffee with the mountain light coming through Evelyn's practical curtains and laying itself across the table between the cup and the letter and the small dish she had taken to keeping near the stove with dried herbs in it that smelled, on warm mornings, like something that belonged exactly where it was. It was Calhoun's wife, Margaret, who said it out loud first. She came by on a Saturday in early May with 2 of her daughters and a quantity of opinions about the condition of the south fence line that she delivered as though Rowan had personally insulted her by not having repaired it already. Rowan received this with the particular patience he had developed for Margaret Calhoun over 20 years of neighborly adjacency. She was not wrong about the fence, and she never delivered an opinion she hadn't inspected personally. And underneath the volume of her, she was one of the most practically useful people within 30 miles of the Blackstone Range. She had brought pie. She delivered the pie to Evelyn in the kitchen with the gravity of a diplomatic transfer, and then stood back and looked at the cabin interior with the thorough attention of a woman taking inventory. Rowan watched from the doorway. "You've done things," Margaret said to Evelyn. "Some things," Evelyn agreed without entirely stopping what she was doing at the stove. "The curtains. The curtains. And those." Margaret pointed at the row of small clay pots along the windowsill that had appeared sometime in March, holding the beginnings of herbs Evelyn had apparently started from seeds she'd brought in her worn suitcase without mentioning. "I like to have things growing," Evelyn said. "It helps me think." Margaret looked at the pots for a moment, then at Evelyn. Then she turned and found Rowan in the doorway and looked at him with the direct zero-ceremony expression of a woman who had been his neighbor since before his first marriage and had not softened her opinions about anything in that entire span of time. "She's good for this place," Margaret said, as though Evelyn were not standing 8 feet away. "I know," Rowan said. "You were a mess before," Margaret continued. "I don't mean anything unkind by it. You were a mess, and this place was a mess, and nobody wanted to say it to you directly because you'd lost Clara, and we all understood, but it was true." "Margaret," Rowan said, "I'm not finished." She wasn't. "What she did in that courthouse, the whole valley's talking about it. You understand that, don't you? What that meant for people beyond just your own property." Evelyn had gone very still at the stove. "I know," Rowan said. "The Dunmore families, the Hessler family on the East Ridge who got a letter from Western Frontier Rail last year and didn't know what to do with it and have been afraid ever since." Margaret folded her arms. "They're not afraid anymore because of what happened in that courtroom." She looked at Evelyn's back. "Because of her." The kitchen was quiet for a moment. Evelyn turned from the stove. She looked at Margaret with an expression that was carefully composed, but not entirely. Something had gotten through the careful composure, something genuine and slightly unguarded, the look of a person receiving something they didn't know they needed until it arrived. "I just read the documents," she said. "Don't do that," Margaret said. "Don't shrink it. I've been doing things my whole life and having people shrink them, and I'm here to tell you it doesn't serve anyone." She picked up the pie dish from the counter where she had set it. "Take the compliment, Mrs. Ashford." Evelyn looked at her for a moment. Then something moved across her face that was as close to unguarded warmth as Rowan had seen from her in company. "Thank you, Mrs. Calhoun," she said. "Margaret," said Margaret, and set the pie back down, which apparently settled that. Summer came to the Blackstone Range the way it always did. Not with a single decisive arrival, but through accumulation. Each week a degree warmer, a week longer, the snow line retreating up the mountain faces and the valley floor turning from brown to the specific green that only happens at altitude in good rainfall years. The kind of green that looks like the land is trying to compensate for everything winter took. Rowan put in the east pasture for the first time in 4 years. He had not planted it the spring after Clara died. He had not planted it the following spring either, telling himself he didn't have the labor for it, which was partly true. The third spring he had looked at the overgrown field and felt something too much like the thing it represented to deal with it directly, and had turned away, and planted the north section instead, and the east pasture had continued being a monument to the thing he couldn't face. This spring, Evelyn asked him about it. Not directly. She asked him what the soil composition was in the east section, and whether it had ever grown winter wheat, and what the drainage was like when the snowmelt came down from the upper ridge. She asked these questions over the course of a week, at irregular intervals, the way she gathered information, not as an interrogation but as an accumulation, each question apparently independent and only forming a picture when you stepped back. He answered each question. He knew what she was doing by the third one, and she probably knew he knew, but neither of them named it, and after the fifth question he went out one morning and began turning the east field. She came out with water at midday, and stood at the edge of the turned earth and looked at it. "Good soil," she said. "My father always said it was the best on the property." "Why didn't you use it?" He looked at the field, dark, turned, smelling of the particular promise that freshly turned earth has, the smell of potential that hasn't become anything yet. "Clara liked this field," he said. "She used to walk it in the evenings." A pause. "After she died, I didn't want to put something growing in it. It felt..." He stopped, started again. "It felt like replacing something." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "It's not replacing," she said. "It's continuing." He looked at her. "The field was here before Clara, and it'll be here after both of us." She looked at the soil. "Using it isn't forgetting her. It's just using the field." She handed him the water. "She'd probably think you were being impractical." He took the water. He thought about Clara, about the specific quality of her practicality, which had been fierce and unsentimental in the way of a woman who had grown up with very little and had strong opinions about waste. He thought about what she would have said about an unplanted field for 4 years. He almost laughed. It was the third time in his life that thinking about Clara had moved him toward a laugh rather than away from everything, and it felt, in some way, that he couldn't have explained, like the healthiest thing that had happened to him in a long time. "She would have been furious with me," he said. "Almost certainly," Evelyn agreed, without missing a beat. He drank the water and went back to turning the field, and Evelyn went back to the cabin, and the afternoon settled into its work the way afternoons do when people are doing what they're supposed to be doing in the place they're supposed to be doing it. He made the Bluebird in June. He had not planned to make it. He was not a man who made things with his hands beyond the functional. Repairs, construction, the ordinary maintenance of a working property. But there was an evening in early June when the light was still in the sky past 8 o'clock, and the day's work was done, and Evelyn was reading her book, the cover of which he had by now identified as a collection of legal history essays, which had surprised him and then unsurprised him. And he found himself at the workbench in the barn with a piece of soft pine and a knife doing something his hands knew without his mind having clearly authorized it. It took 3 evenings. He was not a skilled carver. The wings were uneven, and the tail was slightly too thick, and the beak was not quite right on the first attempt. So he recut it, which improved it, but left a small scar in the wood at the base of the neck that he considered fixing and then left, because the attempt to fix things sometimes made different problems, and the scar was small and did not affect the form. On the 4th evening, he set it on the table in front of Evelyn. She looked up from her book, looked at the bird, set the book down. She picked it up and turned it in her hands, studying it with the same careful attention she brought to documents, which was the highest compliment she could have given it without knowing she was giving it. She looked at the uneven wings, the slightly thick tail, the small scar at the neck. "You made this," she said. "The wings aren't even." "I can see that." She turned it again. "Why a bluebird?" He had been thinking about how to answer this since the first evening in the barn, and he still didn't have a clean answer, which was fine, because clean answers were often less true than the complicated ones. "My mother kept a pair of them in a cage when I was young," he said. "She let them go when I was about 7. I asked her why, and she said, 'Some things are better company when they're free.'" He looked at the bird in Evelyn's hands. "I've thought about that a lot over the years. Didn't always understand it." A pause. "I think I understand it better now." Evelyn looked at him. Her expression was doing the thing it did when something had gotten through. The slight change around the eyes, the quality of attention that shifted from outward to inward. "It's about me," she said, not a question. "It's about what I was looking for," he said. "I thought I was looking for someone to help me run this place, to make the arrangement work. I told myself that's what it was." He held her gaze. "I was wrong about what I was looking for. I didn't know that until you were already here, and it was already too late to pretend otherwise." The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the long summer evening held its light with the generosity of a season that understood it wouldn't last. "Rowan," she said, "you don't have to. I know I don't have to." She set the bluebird on the table between them, carefully. "I came here with nothing, or nearly nothing. I came here because I had run out of other directions, and this one was available and seemed survivable." She looked at the bird. "I did not come here expecting to feel like a person again." The sentence sat between them. She let it sit. "You made me feel like a person again," she said. "Not by doing anything dramatic, just by asking my opinion, listening when I talked, saying thank you when I did something useful and meaning it." She looked up. "By looking at me like I was in the room." He understood what that meant. He understood it specifically because she had told him on the 14th night of a winter that felt like 100 years ago about the particular damage of being invisible inside your own marriage. He had not forgotten it. He had, in fact, turned it over regularly in the months since, checking himself against it the way you check a compass. Not constantly, but whenever the direction felt uncertain. "You were always in the room," he said. "I know," she said. "That's what I'm telling you." He reached across the table, placed his hand over hers. Not a grip, just a placement. Contact. The kind that didn't ask for anything beyond itself. She turned her hand under his and held it. They sat like that for a while, in the long June evening, while the light did its slow business outside and Cole slept by the cold stove, and the bluebird sat on the table between the coffee cups, with its uneven wings and its small neck scar, and its too thick tail, imperfect and complete. The investigation into Western Frontier Rail concluded that September. Hargrove wrote to tell them, a longer letter than his usual style, which told Rowan that the old lawyer had something he wanted to say beyond the facts. The company's 3 senior officers had been indicted on 12 counts, including fraud, forgery, and conspiracy to deprive legal landowners of property. The company itself had been ordered to cease all land acquisition activity in the territory pending the criminal proceedings. 2 of the 14 contested claims had already been returned to their original owners. The remaining 12 were under active review. The Dunmore families, the 2 who had vacated their properties after receiving the same kind of fraudulent claim that had come to Rowan's door, had been contacted by the Attorney General's office about the process for reclaiming their land. Hargrove did not know yet whether they would get it back. The legal machinery for that was complicated and slow, and he was not willing to make promises about timelines that the law might not honor. But the door, he wrote, was open. It had been closed, and now it was open, and sometimes that was the work, getting the door open so that other people had a chance to walk through it. Rowan read that line twice. He passed the letter to Evelyn, who read it at the kitchen table with her morning coffee, and when she finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "The Dunmore families," she said. "I know. If we hadn't challenged it, I know." She set the letter down. She was looking at something past the window, past the herb pots on the sill, now considerably fuller than they had been in March, spilling over the edges of their small clay containers in the way of things that have been given adequate room and decided to use it, past the yard where the east pasture was visible from this angle, green and growing, the winter wheat coming in at a height that Rowan's father would have approved of. "I keep thinking about what Alderley said," she said, "that he'd reported his suspicions twice and received no satisfactory response." She picked up her cup. All that time knowing something was wrong, having the knowledge and not having anyone willing to act on it. "Some things need a particular combination," Rowan said. "The right person with the right information at the right moment." He looked out at the pasture. "Timing." She looked at him. She knew what he was doing with that word, reaching back to the 14th night, to what she had said about timing and cause, the distinction she had drawn that had taken something off him he had been carrying for 3 years. He saw her know it. "Yes," she said. "Timing." "We had a good combination," he said. "We did." She looked back at the window. "We do." The correction was small, but it was not small. She had moved the verb from past to present without pause, the grammatical adjustment of a person who has stopped treating something as a completed event and started treating it as an ongoing one. He noticed it and did not point it out, which was the right choice, because pointing it out would have made it self-conscious, and it was better as what it was, just true, and said without ceremony the way she said things when she meant them most. Calhoun came by in October with his 2 sons to help Rowan repair the roof on the barn's north section, the section that had needed attention since before Evelyn arrived, and had finally deteriorated past the point of patience. They worked through a long Saturday while Evelyn and Margaret Calhoun sat at the kitchen table with coffee and what appeared, from the barn, to be an increasingly animated conversation that Rowan could not hear and did not attempt to. At midday, Margaret brought food out to the work crew and distributed it without being asked, which was her general approach to things, and stood in the yard with her hands on her hips, looking up at the work with the evaluating attention of a woman who understood roofing. "You should have done this 2 years ago," she said to Rowan. "I know. You were letting things go." "Margaret," Calhoun said, with the particular tone of a man who has been married to someone for a long time and has developed a specific vocabulary for this exact type of moment. "He knows I'm right," Margaret said, untroubled. "I know you're right," Rowan said. She looked at him, then at the cabin, then back at him. "You're not letting things go anymore," she said, which was as close as Margaret Calhoun got to saying something kind, and which Rowan understood as such. "No," he said, "I'm not." She gave a satisfied nod and went back inside, and Rowan went back to the roof, and the afternoon was clear and cold in the October way, with that specific blue in the sky that only happens when the light comes in at the autumn angle and the mountains are sharp-edged against it, and everything looks like it has been recently clarified. In the evening, after Calhoun and his sons had gone, Rowan and Evelyn stood on the repaired porch, all 6 boards solid, had been since April, and looked out across the valley toward the mountains. The valley was doing its October thing, the one Rowan had watched for 30 years. The aspens going gold on the lower slopes, the upper ridges already carrying their early snow, the light failing earlier now in the way that always carried a faint gravity, even after decades of witnessing it. The end of something. But that was all right. Things ended. The things worth keeping, you found ways to carry forward. Evelyn had her coat on. She was holding her coffee cup in both hands the way she did when the evenings turned cold. Cole was at the edge of the porch looking down the trail toward the valley with the alert, satisfied posture of a dog who has assessed the situation and found it acceptable. Rowan reached into his coat pocket. He had been carrying the thing in there for 2 weeks, waiting for a moment that felt right, and then deciding that waiting for a moment that felt right was a form of avoidance he could no longer justify. He put it on the porch rail in front of her. It was a ring, not elaborate. A simple silver band with a small inset stone the color of a mountain lake in summer, which he had ordered from a jeweler in Harlan's Crossing 3 weeks before the hearing, which meant he had ordered it when the outcome was not yet known, and they were still counting days and building evidence at a kitchen table by lamplight. She looked at it, then at him. "You ordered this before the hearing," she said. She knew, because she knew how he moved, how long things took to arrive from Harlan's Crossing, and she had done the math instantly, which was one of the things about her. "Yes," he said. That's... She paused. That was a lot of confidence. It wasn't confidence, he said. It was what I wanted regardless of what happened. I wanted you to know that what I thought about you had nothing to do with whether we won. He looked at the ring on the rail. We got married on paper and by arrangement, and because it seemed like a practical solution to a practical problem. I'd like to ask you again, properly, not because anything requires it, because I want you to say yes because you want to. The valley held its silence below them. The last light was on the upper snow. Evelyn set her coffee cup on the rail beside the ring and looked at it for a moment. He had learned to read her silences. This one was not reluctance, not hesitation. It was the silence of a person who takes things seriously and does not rush the moment of saying something true. I came here, she said, with a worn-out suitcase and a dead-end letter and about $11 I didn't mention in my correspondence. He looked at her. $11? I didn't want you to think I was coming without any resources. You had $11. I had $11 and a very good memory and 4 years of courthouse experience. She looked at the ring. I thought that would be enough to make myself useful. I didn't think it would be enough to... She stopped, started again, which she almost never did. I didn't think I'd end up with someone I actually wanted to stay with. I thought I was past that. You're not past that, he said. Apparently not. She picked up the ring, turned it the way she turned everything, the documents, the bluebird, the things that mattered, looking at it from all available angles before making a judgment. It's simple, she said. I know you prefer simple. You know that. Yes. She put the ring on. It fit. He had asked Margaret Calhoun, who had known Evelyn's hand size by a method Rowan had not inquired about and did not intend to. She looked at her hand, then at him. Yes, she said, since you asked properly. He took her hand in his. Not dramatically, just held it, the way people hold things they have come to understand are worth holding. Below them, the valley was going dark, in the way mountain valleys do. From the bottom up, the floor losing light while the peak still held it. The ordinary miracle of altitude and geometry that happened every evening and was never entirely unremarkable no matter how many times you watched it. I was thinking, Evelyn said after a while. About what? Hargrove's offer. About the work. She was looking at the mountains. Not full-time, but the documentation work, the land records, the fraud cases. There may be others like ours. Other families who have the wrong on one side and the truth on the other, and nobody to help them read the difference. She paused. I could do that work and still... She gestured slightly at the cabin, the yard, the valley below. Be here. If that... Yes, he said. I haven't finished the sentence. You don't need to. She looked at him. Something in her face that was not quite a smile but was in the same country as one. You're sure? I've been watching you read documents for 11 months, he said. It would be a waste to stop now. She made a small sound that was unmistakably a laugh. Short and real and unexpected, the kind that escapes before you can consider whether to let it. And he loved it. That specific sound, that specific involuntary honesty, in a way that was part of the larger thing he had stopped trying to find the edge of. Cole stood up from his spot at the porch edge, turned once, and lay back down facing the cabin door, ready, whenever they were, to go inside where it was warm. The mountains held their last light another few minutes, then let it go, the way things let go when they've held on long enough and the time has simply come. And the valley went fully dark and the stars appeared, the particular quantity of them that you only see in country this far from other lights, more than the mind wants to count, more than the eye can fully take in. And the two of them stood on the porch of a ranch that had been saved not by power or money or the favor of institutions, but by a woman who read carefully and a man who had finally, after a long time, learned to let someone read alongside him. Neither of them spoke for a while. They didn't need to. Some things you spend years looking for without knowing exactly what you're looking for, and then you find them in the most unlikely direction, and the finding is nothing like you imagined. Quieter, harder, more imperfect, more real. And you realize the search had never been for the thing you thought you were searching for. It had been for this. For someone who takes up space in the same room as you and makes the room feel different. for someone who tells you the truth when it costs something, for someone whose presence in a doorway changes what the word we means. Rowan Ashford had spent 3 years believing he had come home to a place that held only what was gone. He had been wrong. He had been wrong. And the wrongness had been corrected not by time alone, but by a woman arriving on a train with $11 and a courthouse memory and 4 sentences of honest self-description, and by the slow accumulation of mornings and hard winters and honest conversations and porch boards and documents and a bluebird with uneven wings. He was not a man given to grand conclusions. He believed what he could see and touch and verify. He believed in soil and weather and the long patience of doing necessary work without expectation of elegance. He believed in this. That was enough. It was, in fact, more than enough. It was the kind of more than enough that a person spends a long time learning to recognize, and then, once recognized, never mistakes for anything less than what it is. The stars did what stars do. The mountains held their ground. The valley was quiet and cold and full of the ordinary silence of a place where people live and work and love each other imperfectly and keep going anyway. Inside, the stove was warm,